Hill of Hastings. We're hosting this event jointly with St Matthew's Church in St Leonard's and St Mark's Little Common. We're delighted to welcome you here this evening and also to welcome those who are joining us via live stream. It's great to have you with us as well. I want to say thank you to the Hastings Centre for accommodating us and looking after us so well this evening, and also to all the volunteers who are helping to make this event happen. For your information, the toilets are out through those doors there. They're well signposted. You'll find them if you need them. We're not expecting to hear a fire alarm this evening, but in the unlikely event that there is one, the fire escapes are clearly signposted with the illuminated lights. Well, this evening is the first in a series of events which will be hosted by our churches under the banner of A Passion for Life. As Christians, we believe that Jesus Christ offers all people real, satisfying, meaningful life that lasts. And these events are an opportunity to hear what this life is about and how to find it. As an aid, A Passion for Life has some clearly stated convictions about Christian belief and behaviour on its website, so please do visit that website to have a look. Let me explain what's going to happen this evening. For the first half of the evening, we're going to listen to an interview with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby. He's going to share with us details of his own journey of faith and why he believes Jesus is important and relevant for every person today. The Archbishop will be interviewed by Glen Scrivener. Glen works for an organisation called Speak Life and spends his time speaking to people about Jesus. And then following that interview, we'll have a very short break, just really to stretch our legs. And then you'll have an opportunity to put questions that you have to the Archbishop. After tonight, there'll be an opportunity to find out more about Jesus by coming along to a short course that we're running called Hope Explored. Details of that course are on the invitation cards that are on your seats, and I'll say a little bit more about that at the end. For now, though, I'd like to invite Glen Scrivener and the Archbishop of Canterbury to come to the stage.
Okay, yes, on you go.
Thank you, Glen. Good evening, Archbishop. Good evening, Glen. Archbishop, welcome to Hastings.
Thank you.
Good to have you here. You've had a busy day already. You've done a lot of travelling. Thank you for joining us this evening. We're very pleased to have you here, and we're looking forward to hearing about your own experience of following Jesus.
Thank you.
I'm going to hand over to Glen.
Thank you.
Glen.
Brilliant. And thank you very much, Archbishop. Although you've just said that I can call you Justin, thank you so much. We'd love to get to know Justin Welby in the next 45 minutes or so.
Oh, I'd find that fascinating.
Yes, you might surprise yourself.
You never know.
And then we'll chat a little bit, and then I'll hand over to you to share a few words. And we'll have a bit of a leg stretch in the middle. And during the 3-minute leg stretch, I want you to think of the sharpest, thorniest questions that you could possibly pitch at the Archbishop of Canterbury. And we'll be doing that for about half an hour after that leg stretch. So do be thinking about questions. In order to ask your questions, we will ask you after the leg stretch to come up and use the handheld microphone there. But let's get to know Justin Welby a little bit. So, Justin, I've read you say that you had a strange and lonely childhood. What did you mean?
Well, like many people in this country, I can't remember my parents ever being together. And I was, as far as I knew, an only child. And both parents were alcoholics. And the impact of alcohol, as people here will know, is of absolute chaos not of reasonable amounts of alcohol, but unreasonable amounts of alcoholism. And so childhood was dysfunctional by myself until I went away to boarding school at the age of 8.
Goodness. And in so many ways, that's a very different kind of strange and lonely experience, I imagine. It was Eton that you went to, is that right?
No, not at the age of 8. I went to a school not that far from here, to a school in Seaford.
Okay.
Which has since closed down. Nothing to do with me, it wasn't my fault. And yeah, I mean, it was good old-fashioned boarding school life in the mid-60s, which is to say uncomfortable, isolated, you know, stiff upper lip stuff.
Yes.
It was fine. I mean, it was horrible, but, you know, that was, I sort of assumed, you know, at that age, you don't, you know, people here, you'd know, you don't sort of think this is awful, do you? You just think this is life.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yes.
And then I went off to the other school you named when I was in 1968, I think. Yeah, 68 sounds about right. Or 69. Then
Yes.
69. January 69, that's right.
Okay. And so that would have meant chapel on a daily basis, that sort of thing?
Chapel at both schools.
Yes.
Twice a day, 7 days a week during term.
So what did Christianity mean to you at that moment?
Intense, unremitting boredom.
Yes.
And an opportunity to finish off my homework behind the hymn book.
Yes, yes. And the person of Jesus, was that a part of the mix, or was that just sort of blended into the unremitting boredom?
It's a really good question. I often think about what I did think about Jesus then. I do remember as a very small child when going through a particularly difficult time, thinking, if only Jesus was real and I could meet him.
Okay.
I do remember thinking then, but you know, I knew that was fantasy. So getting to, at school, well, there was the God Squad, but you avoided them. Mm-hmm. And it was something you did. It was a discipline of life.
Okay.
It was a moral code. It was a book of rules.
Yes.
And I wasn't greatly into morality or rules.
Sure. So you avoided the God
What
Squad.
do you mean, sure? Just hang on a minute. Just take a step
yes.
back there. When I say I wasn't particularly into morality and rules, and you say sure, what do you know? That you ought
Who
not
is
to?
these days, honestly? Morality. It's very outmoded. But I very much, when I was growing up, I had a view of God that was pretty much indistinguishable from my view of electricity. You know, I knew that electricity was powerful and that there was some kind of God who was...
Yeah, that would, but not a lot to do with me.
Yes, yes, exactly. And if you harness the power of electricity, it's helpful for your life. And if you get on the wrong side of electricity, zap. And I thought similarly about God.
Oh, no, I didn't go that far.
No? Okay.
No. God was out there, I was in here.
Yes, okay. And therefore, and was the God Squad not cool enough for you? They were...
Oh, they were a bit worrying. They were very intense.
Yes, okay.
They took it seriously.
Yes,
And there were only 10 of them in a school of almost 1,300 people.
yes.
So it wasn't fashionable, it wasn't cool, and it was seriously intense.
Yes,
All to be avoided.
sure. So what squad did you end up running with, if not the God Squad?
No particular squad. My life at school, with the mediocre squad.
Okay, yes.
My life at school was entirely undistinguished in any way at all.
Okay,
I was nowhere near the top of my classes, but I wasn't at the bottom either.
mm-hmm.
I wasn't in any good sports teams, but I was in some very moderate, lower sports teams. I had some nice friends who I still know, but they weren't the really cool lot. If I'd been 10 years younger, I would not have been in with David Cameron or Boris Johnson or anything like that. Mm-hmm. They were the cool kids.
Were they? Yes.
I would imagine.
Yeah.
I wasn't a sort of school prefect or anything like that.
No. Okay. And so nobody was spotting Justin Welby for greatness? No.
Oh, good heavens, no.
Yes.
There's a journalist called Charles Moore.
Yes.
Who writes for The Telegraph and The Spectator. And he said that in a geeky moment when he was, I think he was the year above year or something like that, or the same year as me, but in a geeky moment, he decided he'd make sure he knew who every boy in his year was. Mm-hmm. And I was the only one he could never remember.
I just draw a blank. Okay. Okay, and then you went up to Cambridge to study, was it law and history?
To do law until, in a moment of rare unanimity, the law faculty and I both decided this was a serious error.
Okay.
So I moved to history.
Okay. Okay.
Which I liked.
Which you enjoyed?
I loved.
Why?
Because it's a better subject than law. I enjoyed it. I think part of the reason was at school I had a few teachers who really, really influenced me. And one of them was an amazing guy with cerebral palsy. And it was in my last term at school, and he was teaching philosophy of history. And he treated us like undergraduates at university, or even more graduates at university. He was brilliant. And we were in a very, very old classroom, 15th century, I guess, with wooden pillars holding up the ceiling. And he used to lurch from one pillar to another, holding onto them and just unpacking this extraordinary thing about why history mattered and how you thought about it, how you learnt from it. And it fascinated me to know what had happened and why it had happened and what it meant now.
Yes.
And I was a modern historian, so I was doing later, more recent things, back sort of from the late 18th century, and economic history in the 20th century, lots of economics.
Yes, lots of economics, which would help in your future career, I guess. But there was also a bit of a God squad going on at Cambridge as well, which you sort of got swept up into. Tell us how faith actually developed for you.
In those days, if you were trying to get into Oxford or Cambridge, you did an exam the term after your A-levels. So you stayed on for an extra term and did your entrance exam. And it was a special entrance exam. And my father was going through a particularly difficult period during my A-levels. And it was very complicated and very unpleasant. He was writing to me in very abusive ways every day. And I did very badly in my A-levels. But still I stayed on. And so, anyone here old enough to remember the post office strike in oh yes, one.
I think probably many more do, but they might not want to out themselves.
I don't think so. Looking at you, you're all in your youth group, aren't you? I can't see anyone clearly from here, by the way, so I'm just lying through my teeth, really. But it was the post office strike, and I worked really hard that term. And I remember I got into Cambridge, to my intense surprise. I went into my Cambridge entrance exam In those days, you applied for 5 universities. And I went into my Cambridge entrance exam with the last of the other 4's refusal letter in my pocket.
Wow.
So it was Cambridge or nothing, which is a bit startling. And having got in, that was December 73, I went and taught in Kenya in what was left of the gap year, from January till July 74, in a bush school right out in the middle of nowhere. And there I met people for the first time for whom God was a reality and who had nothing. And both of those things were very striking. And the head teacher at the school had been interned there during the Mau Mau emergency in the 50s on the same site before it was a school, and then it had been turned into a school. And he was completely without bitterness. And I can still remember him and talking to him and listening to him and just being fascinated. The independence had come to Kenya 10 years earlier. So it was a long way back. And I came back to England and went to university and ran as fast as I could for anything involving God, apart from the chapel, which I went to occasionally because it was pretty safe. And it was in my second year, beginning of my second year, that someone asked me out to a meal and a talk. It's a very boring talk. So that was familiar in a church, highly familiar, really. Go to church, get bored. And then we went back to his rooms and sat and talked about Christian faith. And for the first time, it was explained to me about what Jesus had done for me on the cross. That Christians believe that on the cross, God, who reveals himself to us in the person of Jesus, who took human form and lived among us, came to be with us, alongside us, that God on the cross took our sins in his place. He took our sins in our place and paid the penalty for our sins, if you like, stood in our place to face judgment. And that paid for my sins, and in the resurrection of Jesus, historical event, we are given life. So we have our sins forgiven and new life, or as Jesus puts it in John's Gospel, we're born again. And that was the first time it had been really explained.
Gosh. How many chapel services do you think you'd sat through?
10 years, say 35 weeks a year, I don't know, 5,000?
Wow.
Somewhere like that.
Yeah.
And plus 10 Christmases, because we went to church once a year.
Yes.
No, not the whole time, till I was 12. And I remember I sat there and he said to me, so what are you going to do now?
Yes. Is this your friend or this is the preacher?
This was my friend.
Your friend.
No, the preacher.
The preacher, forget the preacher. Okay, you're back
Forget
with your friend.
Preacher. Move on. Probably rather like me. And my friend said to me, so what do you want to do now? And to his intense surprise, I said, well, I think we'd better pray, hadn't we?
Wow. Why? What would make you say that?
I couldn't run any fast. I couldn't run away from God any longer. I'd seen people who loved Jesus. I just couldn't run anymore. And I wasn't even sure I believed. So I prayed and said, I don't know if you exist, but if you do exist, I want you to come into my life and be in charge. And it changed.
It changed? You changed? Was there?
I changed, definitely. There was someone there. And I suppose, that's the point of what we're doing on these things. For those of you who are thinking, oh, golly, can we get away from this gobbledygook? I thought I was coming to watch a good film. What I would say to you is, that's the point this evening. For me, it's to talk about how we get to know who God is and can be sure of his presence in our lives. And I'll say a bit more about that later. But so there was that. So that was the moment.
Yes.
And then that started a rather long journey, which has now been going 48 years.
Amazing. That's where it began. It began with the preaching of the cross, which you didn't understand, but a friend taking you through it.
Yeah.
And then a prayer where you weren't even sure Jesus was there.
Yep.
And he comes in. Someone is there. Someone with a capital S.
Someone is there.
Jesus.
I hadn't a clue what was going on, but someone was there.
Yes.
And there was no pressure. It wasn't cultish or, it wasn't anything funny, peculiar, that is. It was just, there was God.
Yeah. I often say that to people. I often say, you might not think there's anyone on the end of this prayer, but it's a no-lose proposition. If he's not there, he's not going to hear. But if he is there, there's nothing more incredible than meeting him.
I think, it's always struck me, it struck me then in Kenya, and I ran away from it. And then it struck me again that if God exists, that is the most important fact there could be. And millions, hundreds of millions, billions of people for the last 2,000 years have believed that in Jesus they meet God.
Yeah.
That God does exist because he's revealed himself to us. He's shown himself what he's like. And he's done it in 3D.
Yes.
This isn't a book that tells us about him. These are eyewitness accounts who say, this is what we saw.
Yes.
This is what we experienced.
Yes. I mean, it's interesting you say, if God exists, it's the most important thing in the world. And yet, you had a vague notion of a God. I had a vague notion of a God, but it was Jesus that brought it home. If God is like Jesus, here is a God.
Yeah, because if God exists in the way that people claim Jesus was, that Jesus is, then what that's telling us is God isn't out there waiting for us to find God.
Right.
God knows that we can't get to him. So if he's going to know us, and if we're going to know he loves us, then he's got to get to us. Which means he's got to do the walking.
Right.
He's got to do the traveling.
Yes, yes. And in Jesus, we see a unique picture of the God who comes all the way down.
Well, we see a complete picture of who God is. That's the point. There is nothing to add to who we see God is in Jesus. And the Bible is not a set of rules to make our life right. I think I've learned over the years, I used to think that, but I've learned over the years what about approaching that. It is unpacking this extraordinary experience people had of the living God, of God being real.
Right.
It's testimony. It's explaining it all.
Right, right. And so your faith comes alive at university. You graduate. You go into the oil business. We could spend hours talking about the oil business and why you went into that. But
because I couldn't get a job anywhere else.
Okay.
Seriously, it is absolutely true. I really wanted to be a diplomat.
Huh.
And so I went to the careers room, and I got out 3 copies of the application form for the civil service exam for the diplomatic service. And I messed up the first form, and I messed up the second form, and I messed up the third form.
Okay.
And then I came to the conclusion that if I couldn't fill out the form, my chances in the exam were relatively limited. And then I had this fantasy, because it was still the days when if you were thought to be suitable for, secret intelligence service, someone would tap you. There wasn't a process of entry. Your tutor would tap you on the shoulder and say, oh boy, I just think you might think about this. So I was desperately hoping this would happen. Absolutely nothing of the sort happened.
Cambridge is a place for that, but no.
Yeah, but only in those days from the KGB.
Yes, sure, okay.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think MI6 were given. I think they worked in Oxford, which is why it went so badly for a long time.
Yes, the other place.
The other place. And so that was, so that didn't get me very far. And then someone told me that a company in France called Gulf was looking to recruit one English person because they weren't getting on very well with the Brits, and they wanted a specimen, really, so they could study it a bit, because they have big operations in the UK. So I was asked if I wanted to go and have an interview, and I said yes, and on the way over, I thought I'd better read up about it. And I got out their annual report, which I'd got from somewhere, and discovered the company I was applying to wasn't called Gulf, it was called ELF.
Yes.
It's useful, just a tip for anyone thinking of applying for a job. On the whole, it doesn't really work to get the company's name wrong when you're making the application. And anyhow, for some strange reason, they offered me a job. There can't have been any other applicants.
Yes. I mean, your faith came alive at the same time as people like Nicky Lee and Nicky Gumbel and people who Christians in the room might know that they went on to be...
Yeah, that's right. No, they were... I came to Christ in the autumn of 1974. They came to Christ in the spring of 1974, when an amazing, amazing man called David McInnes did a series of talks in which about 250 people were converted. I think one of the great missions that Cambridge ever had.
Yes. And so many from there go into the ministry fairly quickly after Cambridge.
Yeah.
You go into the oil business. Were you sort of looked down on as someone going worldly? Or
not particularly. I think they thought having some people around with some money was quite a good thing. It keeps the church afloat. But no, it wasn't that. I did go and look at the idea for a week. I went on a course to explore the idea of getting ordained, and it just didn't feel right. So I didn't.
So what difference did Jesus make then in the business world?
Huge difference. Enormous difference. I suppose the chief thing, it turned out I was relatively good at that sort of thing, to my intense surprise. And so I found myself quite quickly in a pretty senior position, responsible for the finances of big company, two big companies, successively. And I suppose what the difference it made was I knew this wasn't the ultimate end. It was all relativized. Yeah, it was huge sums of money, enormous, unbelievable sums of money, literally dealing in billions. And yet, that wasn't nearly as important as what Jesus had done. So that's the difference it made. It gave a sense of perspective.
Right.
And he just about kept me on the straight and narrow, because it was a pretty raucous kind of place. And I was traveling a huge amount, and all kinds of things could have gone wrong, but Jesus just showed up.
Yeah. Now, another thing that really tested your faith in those years is in 1983, there was a tragic car accident in which your daughter Joanna died.
Yeah.
How on earth do you get through an event like that? The nightmare scenario for a parent happens, and it happens to you. How do you keep going?
There's all kinds of extraordinarily pious answers. And there's some practical answers. The practical answer is there'll be people here who've had the experience. And I expect you, to some extent, every experience of bereavement is different. And you can't say, this is how you do it, because there isn't this is how I do it. Doesn't mean this is how you do it. I suppose part of it was one step at a time, one day at a time. I went back to work very, very quickly. Mm-hmm. Because people said, oh, you need to take time off. I didn't want empty space. Mm. I couldn't cope with it. Mm. Went back to work, people were very sympathetic. Mm. It's the most extraordinary body blow and utterly grim beyond description. And we used to sit on the floor by the side of the bed and just cry. Yeah. But we were never angry with God, and I've never known a period when, until this job, to be fair, before this job, between that and this job, I'd never known a period where God was so real and so close. And so much weeping with us. One of the Psalms, what's called the prayer book of the Bible, Psalm 56, verse 8, it says, put my tears in your bottle. In other words, don't forget them. Mm-hmm. Store them up. Beautiful, beautiful verse. And in one of Paul's letters, he said, in all things God works for the good of those who love him. It doesn't say all things work for good, which is often misquoted at. Mm-hmm. And that's a bad translation. Some of the old translations have said it. It's wrong. It's in all things, in all circumstances, God works for the good of those who love him. And that verse came to us, and we just found it unbelievably true. And I just remember knowing, amidst the grief, that God was real. It's very strange. Sorry, do you mind if I...
yeah, please, yeah.
And it's very strange. Someone a few years ago said this to us. I was in Pakistan last weekend, and there's the most beautiful young couple, not as young as they were, late 30s, I guess. And they're in Peshawar. They're in Peshawar. They used to live in Peshawar, right up in the north, Taliban-controlled area at the time. And I was there last week. It's still significant levels of terrorism. There was a big bomb there today. And two suicide bombers walked into the church, children's group, Sunday school, at the end of a service about 7 or 8 years ago. And amidst all the children blew themselves up. And 60 children and 70 adults were killed. And this young couple they lost their baby. She was holding the baby. She had a leg terribly damaged. He was inside. And when I saw them 18 months after the attack, I was with my wife in Lahore, and her leg was still terribly damaged. You could see her limping. She has a face which is, not beautiful in the classic sense. There's just an inner beauty, which is, and her husband as well, which is just. And she said to the two of us, now we know that God is good.
Wow.
And that's what I think we'd have said. And so when she said it, I understood that.
Help us process that, because if someone's just sitting here and say, well, surely this is the time to say God is not good. This seems totally upside down. This is the worst thing imaginable. This is proof that God is bad, if he's there at all. How does that make sense?
It's a really good question. I think because he showed up. We knew at the moment of the car crash, just after it, I wasn't there. And Joanna lived for 5 days after the car crash. I still miss her. Still miss her so deeply. But immediately after the car crash, she went through the front window. And Caroline wasn't driving, but she got out the passenger side and ran over, picked her up. And she said it's the closest she's ever, she doesn't know whether it was audible or not audible or what it was, but a voice said to her, "I am still with you."
Wow.
And he was. And if it had just been that, and then nothing after, I think one would have said, "Oh, well, shock of the accident." But it cashed out in prayers that were heard, in people that were there, but most of all in a spiritual presence, in knowing at the moment she died, of knowing that we'd put her into the arms of Christ, and he had taken her in his arms to care for her.
Yes. So, and therefore hope of holding her again.
Whatever that means, yes, I agree. I mean, is she an adult? I don't know. That's above my pay grade.
Yes.
But
yes.
Knowing that there's no prayer, knowing that he has but borrowed them for a moment.
I was speaking 2 years ago to a woman who came to faith through the stillbirth of her first child, and just utterly heart-wrenching, but she didn't know what to do with her pain, so she showed up at church. And she said to me that there's two things that I came to see, and one was that the death of my perfectly formed little child was wrong. And she went on to have 2 more children. The other thing she came to see was that she has 3 children, not 2.
Oh, golly.
You know?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It took me 20 years to get over. We had 5 more children.
Yes. Yes.
Someone one of these days needs to tell me what causes it. But I'm a vicar, so, I don't really know these things. But we have 5 more children, and it's so embarrassing in supermarkets because it is a big family, 5 children.
These days.
These days. And we'd get to the checkout, and all the other children had never, of course, met Joanna, but they knew about her because we celebrate her birthday every year. We call it our family day. And the checkout person would say, "Oh, you've got a big family," and say to one of the kids, "How many are there of you?" And they'd say, 6, but one's with Jesus in heaven. In a completely matter of fact, complete collapse of lady at checkout or man at checkout.
Yeah.
So I'd
Beautiful,
understand that. You don't.
Yeah.
They are still part of the family.
Yes. Yes.
Can't escape that.
So, at some stage, you're in the oil business and you feel the call to ministry. What is that, and why?
Ministry.
Yeah. Well, what is the call that people sometimes?
No, I was just winding you up. I've spent 9 years being interviewed, and I've done a bit of interviewing the last few weeks. It's just great fun winding people up. Cruel. I have a cruel and sadistic sense of humour. I must repent of that. Perhaps I might give it up for next Lent. No, what does it mean? Well, again, that was very unusual for me. At church, a place called Holy Trinity Brompton, one Sunday evening. And there was a guy from the States, from a vineyard church, who was speaking, talking about his own experience of knowing that the right thing to do was get ordained, although he had a job offer from NASA and was a very good engineer. And I was just sitting there, and this voice came into my head, "That's what I want you to do. Not go and work for NASA."
Right.
Yeah.
It's not rocket science. Yeah.
Okay. Hands up those who think that was a really good one.
Thank you.
And on the way back, I remember exactly where I said it. We were parked up Queensgate, and we turned down at the bottom of Queensgate onto the Cromwell Road. As we went round the corner, I said to Caroline, "This is what happened."
Okay.
And we actually didn't crash. And we, it took 2 years, and the longer it went on, the less I wanted to get ordained.
Right.
Because the more we thought when we sort of actually spent a day fasting and praying about it, and very methodically filled out sheets of paper with the reasons for ordination, the reasons against, at the end of the day, we had 3 pages against and 1 line for.
Yes.
And the line for was, if God is calling, then it's the best choice.
Yes. Kind of outweighs the others.
It kind of outweighs the others. And I just couldn't get away from it. And in the end, in my final interview, that's what I said to the bishop. He said, "Why do you want to get ordained?" And I said, "I don't." You may notice a pattern emerging here of me not being incredibly good at interviews. He said, "What will you do if we say no?" And I said, "Go back to London and take my wife out to the best meal I can afford to celebrate." And they said yes.
Not initially, did they? They initially turned you down, is that right?
Oh, a bit earlier. Yeah, I got over the initial being turned down.
Okay,
To quote a bishop, I've interviewed more than 1,000 potential candidates for ordination, and you're not in the top 1,000. And he went on to say, "You have no future in the Church of England."
Well.
Quite a lot of people would say he was entirely right.
I couldn't possibly comment. But, okay, so you then go into, you train for ordination, you go into parish ministry. I've heard you say that parish ministry is as busy, you can be as busy as a parish priest as you are as the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Oh, golly, yes.
Is that possible?
Absolutely.
Yeah?
And you're less resourced.
Yeah.
And quite often, even nowadays, though it shouldn't really happen, but it does, you're on your own. Or you're having to take a lot of decisions on your own. And it doesn't matter if you're talking who you're taking a wedding for, or who you're involved in a funeral for. They're all equal. And there's no, I mean, it may be more public, so the adrenaline runs more, but it's no more important. And I just think it was the most stressful, the hardest work I have ever done in my life, by a long way.
That surprises me because I see you as a leader who does not wear the burden of responsibility heavily. It doesn't come across to me, and I don't think it comes across to many others, that you wear the... It feels to me like you quite enjoy being Archbishop of Canterbury. Do you?
On the whole, yes. I'm conscious... Yes, I do. No, I think it's fair to say I do. There are absolutely horrible bits.
Like what?
Anything to do with abuse.
Yes.
Dealing with the consequences of half a century of the church failing to deal with abuse, probably longer, but we can't remember beyond that. Division in the church, Christians hating each other. Because it's so contrary to what Jesus tells us. He says, love one another. He even says, love your enemies. I've got to be one of them. And antagonism of Christians to each other, those are the horrible bits. But to be honest, if I'm really honest, doing this sort of thing, I'm not that keen on talking about myself, so this is a bit painful, but I'm really keen about talking about Jesus and sharing who this incredible figure is, who is God, who changes the world, who calls us it's such a privilege. And so I do enjoy that.
Good, but there must be so many burdens on you. I mean, you're the spiritual leader of 90 million Anglicans around the world.
Yes, 85 actually.
85, okay. I'm an evangelist, I always inflate figures.
Yeah, that's right. It's probably about 30, but I'm an evangelist too. It just makes me sound humble if I say, if I run it down a bit. I think, yes, going to Pakistan, being with people who are being persecuted, going to all kinds of other places, the pressure, but the pressure is no greater than taking the funeral of an 8-year-old in my parish church. Only I've got lots more people supporting me. I'm prayed for every day by literally millions and millions of people. Well, I'm not grumbling. That's a big thing. And parts of the job are such fun. As long as you're sober, walking in a straight line, and not actually sort of attacking people every 3 paces, there are lots of places where merely by showing up, you make people feel better. Refugee camps in the Eastern DRC.
Yes.
And when you feel so empty inside, so lacking in anything, because Brits tend to be pragmatists. So you go to a refugee camp or a place where you're standing by a mass grave and you want to fix it. Well, it's not fixable. And then you realize that God is saying, the Holy Spirit is saying, look, I'll do the heavy lifting, you just show up. Stop trying to be clever, just love these folk. And the best way of loving them, in my case, is often to shut up and be there. Right. And say very little except a little bit about Jesus.
Yes, the non-anxious presence, you're playing chaplain to them.
Yeah, and it, actually we've gone there. My wife she's developed over the last 9 years, or God has developed, in the most beautiful way, a very small thing, going in and working with bishops' wives in areas of conflict and civil war and difficulty. And she does that. And I just remember she told me on one occasion, when she went to South Sudan, where the civil war was going pretty badly, I mean. And when she got off the plane, it was just her. The bishops' wives came to meet her at the airport, and they were dancing and singing, and they were all saying to her, "You came, you came, you came." There's an awful lot we can do just by showing up.
Amazing.
It's an awful lot any of us, funnily enough, can do just by showing up with people in trouble. You don't have to be clever, you just have to show you care.
That's brilliant. I've got so many more questions to ask, but I will rely on you guys to be asking those questions after we do a leg stretch in about 10 minutes. But I've got one final question before you say a few words, Justin. And I've asked you this question already. As a 17-year-old, who was Jesus to you back prior to your conversion? So let me ask the question to you today, 2022. Who is Jesus to you?
Jesus is my Lord and Master in every aspect of my life, who knows me through and through and loves me perfectly, who calls me and leads me and loves me just the same when I fail and when I succeed, and who's paid for all my sins, and whose life is in me and will take me to be with him forever. Nothing very big.
That is beautiful. Ladies and gentlemen, the Archbishop of Canterbury. would you like to say a few words?
Would I like to say a few words? Actually, when you're introducing an archbishop, the way you do it is to say, please only say a few words. Because archbishops tend to talk while they're working out what they want to say. I just want to say, just comment briefly, I suppose, about, relatively briefly for me, about the situation that we're facing in the world at the moment, and why I think Christian faith is so important, but to put it more accurately, because why we have to ask not what do we believe, but who do we follow? That's the question I'm putting to you. Who do we follow? And we're facing, in the next 30 or 40 years, scientists and the engineers and IT experts say that in artificial intelligence, in biogenetics, in neurosciences, in robotics, in biological sciences, we are facing the biggest change that the world has ever seen in that kind of period in human history. And it's a change that that makes the coming of the motor car or the Industrial Revolution will pale by comparison. It seems highly likely that our grandchildren, children, 20 years on, will be fascinated by the story of how we passed something called a driving test. Because in our day, when you got into a car, there was something called a steering wheel, and you had to guide the car. Are you seriously telling us, Grandpa, that it didn't take you itself? You say, yes. Well, wouldn't there have been crashes the whole time? Yes. And at the same time as these huge changes, robotics and all these areas, which are just coming to the cusp, biological science will have given us huge power to design children or to heal diseases in the most remarkable way. And at the same time, we will face the common threat, which we've just had a taste of with COVID, the common threat of climate change. In 1945, there were 25 million refugees in the world after the greatest war in human history. Today, there are 85 million refugees in the world. The best estimates from the climate scientists is conditions at the way they're going at the moment, by 2050, which is only less than 30 years away, will mean that there'll be somewhere between 800 million and 1.2 billion people displaced by climate change. Not many of them in Europe, but huge numbers in Africa. And when you displace people, they don't disappear, they have to go somewhere. And people movements lead to war. And so we're facing a world in which technological and scientific change, the threats of climate change, the capacity to wage war, particularly with robotics on the battlefield, those changes have two possible ways they can go. One is that the world becomes infinitely more unequal and unjust, but we hold that only by being willing to see many, many die in terrible conditions around the world and hold on to our standard of living. The alternative is that there is a generosity, a selflessness, a willingness to give up gaining all we can in order to see others gain what they need in order to survive and flourish as human beings. And for all those, not all, not climate change, but to see the advances in science, technology being used to solve so many of the problems we face today. That's the way it's going. What's going to make the difference? It's not our natural goodness, I want to suggest to you, because I don't think that in large masses people are naturally that good. Individually, we know that we have a tendency towards putting ourselves first. Collectively, we do it even more, even when we know it's not quite right. We are naturally people who are within limits, not thankfully here to the extreme. We are a generous society, but within limits. And each of us knows that we don't keep up to our own standards to the degree we should. That's called sin. It's what the Bible calls sin. And the consequences of injustice, of selfishness in the face of great catastrophe, of letting wars flourish, of not using all our strength and all our capacity and all our brilliance in this wonderful country and others around the world, which, by the grace of God, have so much, of not using them for every person. The consequences of that, frankly, are that God is judgment. And God's judgment in this world, there is eternal judgment, but in this world, God's judgment is often letting us have what we choose. That's how the Bible tells us that judgment works in this world. God says, well, if you want to live that way, fine. See how it goes. So if you want to live curved in on yourself, God doesn't stop you. He says, fine. And we experience the consequences. Judgment is letting us have the consequences of living our way. So how do we answer that is, I suppose, the comment I want to make. What I want to put to you is that God offers us a freedom and a liberation from ourselves, from our selfishness, from our sin. Liberation from guilt, liberation to live as we ought, knowing that we are loved by God, and with that love, we love others, and that love is infinite. Liberation from guilt because all our sins have been paid for, and liberation from fear of the future and anxiety about the future, because we know it is in the hands of God. There's so much more one can say, but I'm not going to go on forever. I believe that is what knowing Jesus offers us. It's certainly what I've experienced. And liberation from issues of identity and things like that, which someone might ask a question about or not. Liberation from saying, I'm a failure and I'm no good. Or even if we feel it, and I feel it quite often, the liberation of knowing that God knows we're not a failure and we are some good and we're worth dying for. That's speaking into our hearts that says, you are loved by the eternal creator of the universe, who will take you to be with him forever at the end of your life. And one of the most striking things, I've been reading John's Gospel for the last few months, very slowly and thoughtfully and meditatively. One of the key things Jesus says in that, he asks a question, what are you seeking? What do you desire? What do you really desire? That you'd never tell anyone that you really want. What are you really seeking? And Jesus says, seek me. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And he says, what's your life worth? Because he says, if you seek to gain the whole world, you'll lose everything. But if you lose the whole world for my sake, you will have everything. Second question, first question, what are you seeking? Second, what is your life worth? And third question is, how then will you live? Will you live following Jesus, finding love, the Spirit of God within you, teaching you through the scriptures and through friends and in prayer and so many ways what it is to live a life that involves service and sacrifice, yes, but being able to share the love of God? Or will you live a life, and I'm using an ancient expression, that is turned in on yourself, in which in the end you become your own jailer and prison? I want to just leave those questions with you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, let's... thank you. I hope you are thinking of questions right now to ask the Archbishop after our little leg stretch. You will notice one way you can stretch your legs is by taking a trip to the back table where we are signing people up for Hope Explored. Justin Welby has just spoken to us about the future. And the strapline for the Hope Explored course is, what's the best future you could ever imagine? How can we live with hope in such uncertain times? It's a 3-week course that the 3 churches that are putting on this event in Hastings and St. Leonard's and Bexhill are putting on. You'll see those details on this card, but we'd love you to sign up just so we know how many chairs we can set out for these great courses where you can explore hope together. Now let's have our little break for 3 minutes, and when we come back, we'll have Q&A with the Archbishop. Thanks so much.